Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well. Let's sort the camera out a little bit. You know the drill by now, folks. No, it's not because say it with me, it doesn't suit the narrative. No, it's time for the book again. So, we're on page 31, I believe. I had only gone past page 30, and I had basically gotten up to pretty much the very first line of page 31. So, without further ado, let's begin. Let's consider another aspect of the misdirection. In all of the thousands and thousands of news stories about Tommy Robinson, they always mention his other name, Stephen Lennon. But people are banned from their jobs for life if they dead name a transsexual. So why do the news media always do this to with Tommy Robinson? Again, it is a smear tactic. The idea this man has more than one name and therefore we should not be trusted. Remember that Viscount Anthony Wedgwood Ben, a far-left lord and a Fabian, always insisted on being called Tony Benn, to pretend he was one of the people. No one cared that his lord temporarily gave up his lordship so he could take a seat in the House of Commons, rather than let someone less privileged than him sit there. The left will allow the 1% a free pass, and provided the 1% espouse leftism. Sir Anthony Charles Lytton Blair always goes by the name Tony Blair. And I can't really call him sir, because let's face it, we all know Tony the war criminal Blair is not worthy of the word sir. But I digress. And Lord David Cameron famously told people, "Call me Dave," to pretend he wasn't part of the elite. Strangely, whilst those posh boys all wanted to pretend that they are of the people, the head of the Socialist Party in Britain is happy to be called Sir Keir. Well, I'm not going to be calling him Sir Keir. He will always be, and forever will be in our eyes, Keir the traitor Starmer. The avowed supporters of this Socialist Party apparently have no problem with their leader named Sir Keir. But you might hear said... Sorry, that just stunned me for a moment. But you might hear said Tommy Robinson is an entirely different name from Stephen Lennon. Yes, and Appendix 6 is just a sample of famous people who have had entirely different names, yet the news media almost never, ever draws attention to their real names, whilst the journalists will always do the opposite with Tommy Robinson. Some of the aliases respected by the news media were even convicted criminals. Nelson Mandela, Stalin, Lenin, Malcolm X. Being serious convicted criminals, including convictions for terrorism, doesn't stop them from being respected and praised by the media. Those criminals are only known by their assumed names because journalists are always acting as political agents of the fascist state. Interestingly, when people convert to Islam, as with transgenders, their new Islamic names are almost always respected by the news media, except when the journalists want to pretend that an Islamic terrorist wasn't really a Muslim. This was the case with the beheading of Lee Rigby on the streets of London by Mujahid Abu Hamza, Michael Adebolajo, and Ismail ibn Abdullah, Michael Adeboale. The media would not name them using their chosen Islamic names. In fact, the news media almost never mentioned that these men, following Muhammad's commands to kill the unbelievers, wanted to be known by their Islamic names. A Google search in 2024 for the number of times these devout Muslims were known by their Islamic names on the same page as their dead names shows a mere 247 results. A 2024 search for them by the dead names before they were converted to Islam shows 20,700 pages. For every one time their chosen Islamic names were used, they were 83 times when they were dead named, which just proves that the news media exists entirely to manipulate your perception of the elephant, with the parts of the body, and basically it feels like a wall, feels like a tree, feels like this, that, and the other. For anybody who didn't get that in the last video. Let's compare this with a 2024 search for the number of times that Tommy Robinson and Stephen Lennon are put together on the same page. 52,000 times. The journalists are all, almost without exception, paid propagandists. The journalists, in air quotes both of these times by the way, have more respect for genocidal mass murderer and convicted criminal Joseph Stalin than they do for Tommy Robinson. We leave it up to you to decide if they have respect for the devout Muslims whom they insist on dead naming. This systematic bias is not restricted to the reporting on Tommy Robinson. Political figures who do not describe themselves as far-right are routinely and systematically smeared by journalists. For example, the AfD in Germany, Donald Trump in the USA, Eric Zemmour and Marine Le Pen in France, Giorgia Meloni and Matteo Salvini in Italy, Viktor Orban in Hungary, showing that the journalists are in fact political activists pretending to be journalists. The journalists will go out of their way to describe some terrorists using the terminology the terrorists insist the journalists use. Equally, if a terrorist group has obviously Islamic wording in its official description, the BBC will give it a fake name to disguise that the group is Islamic. The Houthi movement, officially known as Ansar Allah, stroke number one. It was all going so well up to this point. The helpers of Allah are almost never described by the latter name, by the propagandists pretending to be journalists. The journalists deceive in order to stop the public seeing the part of the elephant that is Islamic terrorism. Equally, the group of the people of Sunnah for Dawah and Jihad are referred to by the prostitutes as Boko Haram. Thus, after Hamas carry out terrorist activities, including mass murder, rape and beheading of babies, the BBC refused to call them terrorists. The full name of Hamas is Islamic Resistance Movement. And then, when Hamas carry out the kind of butchery found in the core Islamic texts, the elite will say Hamas are not Islamic. The gaslighting is so pervasive and systematic that the public have no idea of the scale of what is really going on. State broadcaster the BBC asserts that calling a transgender individual by its previous name is dead naming and is seen by the BBC as a form of inhuman abuse. Shall we tell that to the governor of HMP Woodhill about the abuse that Tommy Robinson's going through in jail right now, where he's being forced to have only tuna, which could make him seriously ill? No, I didn't think so either. Anyway, back on point. Meanwhile, BBC News is happy to designate legitimate political groups and actors as far-right, when that's a label rejected by the defamed person or group, and BBC News staff are in full knowledge that doing so will lead to financial, social, and even violent repercussions for the persons so abused by these journalists. Hamas, terrorists, and transgenders are to be allowed self-definition which the state broadcaster insists should be respected, because doing so suits the political agenda of the journalists and the state. Other groups are not allowed to self-definition because it does not suit the political agenda of the journalists and the state. And as we will show, the other news organisations like The Guardian and The Independent are off the scale when it comes to their political bias, and I honestly thought I was going to have another stroke then. Anyway, the BBC's editorial guidelines are laughable, at best. We operate in the public interest, reporting stories of significance to our audiences and holding power to account. In our journalism in particular, we seek to establish the truth and use the highest reporting standards to provide coverage that is fair and accurate. Sure, BBC. Their double standards are manifest and easily exposed. If they wanted to be fair and accurate, they would have adopted a single rule. Refer to the individual organisation by the description they offer of themselves. The BBC will do this for Hamas and transgenders, but not for bona fide political parties in so-called democratic countries. Elsewhere, the BBC elaborates on their editorial guidelines, stating that the guidelines also make clear the BBC's impartiality is not value-free and that it incorporates the values of a democratic society. Yet the BBC will show respect for a terrorist group like Hamas in its attacks on the civilians in a democracy such as Israel. But the BBC will not show you impartiality for legitimate political parties within democracies, unless the elite approves of those parties. For decades, the BBC has resisted describing terrorists as terrorists, which exposes the hypocrisy of the BBC's claim that its editorial guidelines are about democratic values. When terrorism is about using violence against civilians to achieve political ends, rather than using the machinery of democracy. The BBC holds power to account by respecting the rapists and murderers of Hamas, while refusing to show the same respect to those who are opposed to terrorism. The BBC, funded by criminalising British citizens, boasts about having the world's most visited news site. And that was my Discord just came along. Anyway, but they pretend, as the state broadcast... I've just completely lost myself. That Discord beat has just completely distracted me. Give me 1 second. I'm going to step back a bit, just in case I've missed a bit. So, the BBC, funded by criminalising British citizens, boasts about having the world's most visited news site, but they pretend, as the state broadcaster, they hold power to account. In chapter 3.11 below, we will explain how this crypto-fascist state broadcaster was set up in the 1920s, at the height of the vogue of fascism. Just like fascist dictators claim that they channel the will of the people, so the BBC claims its knowledge of it channels the interests of the public. The elite pretend they have godlike knowledge of our interests. If the BBC operated in the public interest, they would have let the public decide how the BBC functions. We are criminalised if we don't fund the BBC, yet we have no control over their propaganda, which is beamed into every home. The British media's obsession with smearing as far right any opposition to the elitist, self-contradictory, progressive agenda is easily proven. If you search Google for the frequency with which the supposedly impartial quality news media refer to far left or far right, the comparative results will be found in Appendix 10. This would be an impartial result only if, for the past 3 decades, vastly more political actors in the West describe themselves as far right than far left, but that is demonstrably not so. The BBC falls in line with the Telegraph and the Times in over-reporting on the far right, the far right, at least 3 times more than the Guardian? Than the far left. The Guardian is clearly demented in reporting on the far right 25 times more than the far left. The left labelled their project stroke number 2, progressive, when in truth they are leading the public into serfdom. But they want the public to think that the destination is some modern utopia, that the transition to this utopia for the leftist elite, but serfdom for the masses, is inevitable. The only progressive thing about their project is that under the English socialism, Orwell's Ingsoc in his novel 1984, Fabian socialism, the movement to this serfdom, should be so gradual that the public are unable to identify what is being done to them. Perhaps the Guardian staff are told to distract from the fact that their entire leftist newspaper was funded for the best part of a century using capitalist tax loopholes, trust funds, and the shadowy offshore banking of the plutocrats. That the trust was dissolved and reformed in 1948, as it was thought that the trust, under the terms of the original trust deed, had become liable to tax due to changes in the law. As for January 2016, the company funds were over 740 million, down from 838.3 million in July 2015. As of 1st of April 2018, the value of the Scott Trust Endowment Fund was 1.01 billion, down slightly from 1.03 billion in 2017. While the pro-tax, anti-billionaire leftists are kept hysterical on the non-existent threat from the far right, they don't question why the biggest leftist international news group is owned by a company valued at 1 billion. Perhaps you think our attitude is cynical. Well, here is an advert The Guardian shows to people visiting their website, and I quote, "Do you know who hates The Guardian? The billionaires creating a world that's more unequal than ever. the populist politicians spreading discord and misinformation, the fossil fuel executives watching the planet burn as their profits swell, the tech giants shaping a new world around us without scrutiny. And do you know who does like us? People who believe in a free press. Yeah, try not to laugh at that one. Anyway, people who believe that the truth should be available to everyone, and people who recognize the importance of challenging those in positions of power and influence. The Guardian doesn't have an ultra-rich owner. No one tells us what to write, or what not to write. We stand up to expensive legal threats to bring readers the truth. With your help, we can hold the rich and powerful to account, whether they like it or not. Emphasis added. End quote. The Guardian is literally owned by a billionaire corporate body, but they know that their readers aren't going to realise this, so the leftists raise money from the public, pretending these elitist journalists are downtrodden nobodies. And we all know that's a crock of shit. They are not downtrodden nobodies. They're a bunch of traitors, but I digress. The 2023 annual report for the owners of The Guardian says that it is the sole shareholder and ultimate owner of GMG, the business responsible for the publication of Guardian journalism. Moreover, by 2023, the sole shareholder had $1.23 billion in funds and was reporting an annual revenue of $264 million. Of course, the so-called independent has also seen the potential financial value in terrifying leftists with the threat from the far right, so their far right scare ratio is 3 times higher than the BBC. See Appendix 10. The BBC doesn't have to be as demented as The Guardian because the BBC is funded through the force of the criminal courts of the state, which courts are themselves funded by taxes on the population. So the public are funding their own indoctrination through the BBC license tax. The BBC tax. They've crossed out license. Tax loophole for global corporations and tax exemptions for politicised charities. Here's another way in which you can see that the far right is a fantasy. There are over 50 radical leftist bookshops in the UK and more than a dozen leftist stroke number 4 publishing companies. See Appendix 11. There's so many of them, they can run a conference and produce a newsletter on their niche market. How many right-wing bookshops are there in the UK? I'll give you 3 guesses on that one. Time's up. 0! If you Google right-wing bookshops, UK or Britain, the results returned are all leftist bookshops. Google cannot find a single right-wing bookshop in the entire country. Substituting conservative bookshop also returns no results, yet the quality media in the UK is obsessed with the fantasy of the far right. But when the state tells them to ignore actual Nazis performing ethnic cleansing, nearly had another stroke, cleansing in Europe in the 21st century, the Nazi-obsessed news media and the state-funded anti-fascists will ignore the real, live, avowed Nazis. People who denounce Nazism are attacked by anti-fascists. Actual Nazis are protected by anti-fascists. It's an upside-down world intended to manipulate the public. If we are to take a casual definition of right-wing to be the policies listed by the leftist site Wikipedia, anti-communist removal of state power, nationalism, traditional values, populist promoting Christianity, above all other religions, promoting elitism, etc., etc., we would see that none of these positions apply to any government in Britain since the Conservatives removed Thatcher as their leader. So it can't be said that Britain has a right-wing government in the past 35 years. Yet Britain's media is obsessed with the far right, moves one step away from the positions of the Conservatives and back towards 19th century liberalism, and you are far right. In the past 35 years, how many of the governments in the West have been of parties which these impartial journalists would recognise as far right? Perhaps only Orban's massively popular government in Hungary and Italy's recent turn towards Salvini and Meloni, though these governments would also repudiate the designation far right imposed by the impartial journalists. All the governments in the West have been leftist, including Britain's Conservative government from 2010 to 2024. As can be seen from the table in Appendix 10, the news media obsession ranges from a bias of 3 times to a bias as high as 24 times, The Guardian. Since this bias is to be found across all quality media, there's every reason to believe it will be found in broadcast media such as BBC TV and radio news, independent TV news, Sky Channel 4, etc., other talk radios, and even recent entrants such as Times Radio since 2020. The UK is awash with fake news, i.e. progressive propaganda, branding any opposition to the policies of the elite as being far right or populist. Populist means a situation where the elite are less in control than they would like to be. And obviously, that is a very big threat to our establishment. Even worse, while claiming that any opposition to the socialism of the elite in the West is far right or Nazism, the elite are literally funding and arming National Socialists in Ukraine to provoke war with Russia. See Chapter 4.7 below and see Appendix 5, which shows from 2009 to 2021, the media in the West talked about the National Socialist far-right white supremacists in Ukraine. Moreover, just as we're putting the final touches to this book, this headline appeared. Germany deports 7 Ukrainian soldiers for wearing Nazi symbols. 16th of May 2024. The article goes on to say, and I quote, in a moment, German authorities say all Ukrainian military personnel arriving for training will be explicitly instructed that it is prohibited to display Nazi symbols. Emphasis added, end quote. For the elite in the West, the problem is not that they are arming and funding National Socialists. The problem is that the public might find out. Well, they have now, because I'm telling it. For the elite in the West, the problem is not that they are arming or funding as long as, I'm repeating myself, as long as Ukraine's National Socialists don't display their allegiance openly, the elite in Germany, or USA, or UK, or Canada, have no problem with these Ukrainian National Socialists. Meanwhile, the same politicians and the media will defame Tommy Robinson or Donald Trump as far-right or fascist. Naturally, this report about Germany expelling avowed Ukrainian National Socialist troops is not covered in the free press of the West. Is it any wonder that the liberal West banned Russian news since 2022? Or news reports since 2022. But luckily, the story was also covered in Israeli and Indian news media, Appendix 5. Appendix 5 charts how the free press in the West is simply the mouthpiece of the elite. How they will rearrange the news to suit whatever the government's political goals are. In the UK, the government-sanctioned self-styled anti-fascist organisation Hope Not Hate, or Hate Not Hope, was founded by a former member of the communist organisation Searchlight. This is basically going into some of the bits that was exposed during Panodrama. Anyway, after the 2014 US-funded coup in Ukraine, in 2018 was pointing out how National Socialists from around from Europe were in the UK and Ireland trying to recruit sympathisers to go to Ukraine to join the stroke number 5, National Socialist Azov Battalion. In 2020, Hope Not Hate was reporting how a Ukrainian minister in Zelensky's government was accompanying National Socialist group C-14 on the hunt for Roma around Kiev. I could do with the Kiev right now. Anyway, in Zelensky's Ukraine, the relationship between the state and far-right civil organisations remains firm. In 2021, H&H, Hope Not Hate, produced a report on far-right extremism in Europe, in which they said of Ukraine, and I quote, "The Azov movement continues to be by far the most dominant far-right force in the country, encompassing a number of linked related subgroups and beginning to monopolize organized far-right activities in the country. Some formerly more independent groups like Tradition and Order have clearly come under Azov's umbrella, while groups that used to conflict more openly with Azov, like Society of the Future /C14, appear to have come to an understanding and, in some cases, cooperation. End quote. The same report describes the views of Tommy Robinson, Nigel Farage, Britain's Reform Party, and UKIP as far-right extremism, putting them in the same category as the openly National Socialist militia, or socialist militia, in Ukraine. But when Hate Not Hope produced their State of Hate reports in the subsequent years, there's no mention of Ukraine's National Socialists. Hate Not Hope are not going to say anything that will embarrass Britain's fascist state and its funding and support for Nazis and jihadis. At the very time when Russia declares it's fighting a war to destroy the same Ukrainian National Socialists, stroke number 6, to destroy the same Ukrainian National Socialists previously flagged as a problem by Hate Not Hope, the government-sanctioned organization instead focuses in 2023 on conspiracy theories about the war in Ukraine. The Russian invasion of Ukraine in February last year attracted much attention. Conspiracy theorists believe the war is a diversion from a larger, more sinister global plot and/or the trigger for an intentional global economic crisis. End quote. A self-styled anti-fascist organization serving up the narrative of the anti-democratic elite Western governments and funded by those same governments. I took a moment there. No mention from these anti-fascists of the Ukrainian soldiers with SS stormtroop. Can't remember what they're called. I'm trying to remember what SS was now. Fucking hell. Insignia are being trained across the West by the governments who we are compelled to fund. See Chapter 4.7 below. In August 2024, while Britain's government-funded anti-fascist organisations were denouncing the working class of Britain as far-right, the Italian state broadcaster interviewed a soldier in Ukraine who was wearing a hat with the SS insignia. The Italian reporter apologised for not noticing the SS insignia in front of his eyes, but of course the British news media, obsessed with the mythical far-right in Britain, ignored the actual Nazis fighting for EU democracy in Ukraine. These state-funded anti-fascist organisations know their funding depends on them, doing the bidding of the fascist state so they can form. While in 2022, Hate Not Hope would denounce people like Tommy Robinson as, quote, Putin's useful idiot. Hate Not Hope would have nothing to say just 2 years later in 2024 when the Ukrainian Azov battalion sporting their SS logo were in the UK Parliament being praised by MPs. Hate Not Hope would have nothing to say about the Parliament of Canada in 2023 giving 2 standing ovations to a man who had been a member of the Waffen-SS. Hate Not Hope is the government-sanctioned lapdog that didn't bark in the night. It demonises those who oppose the fascist state, and it remains quiet about the fascist state funding Nazi militias. Just as the controlled media went from talking up the problem of National Socialists in Ukraine from 2009, to denying their existence from 2022 onwards, so anti-fascist organisation Hate Not Hope, funded by a registered charity, stroke number 7, fucking hell, we are not doing very well here, funded by a registered charity of the same name, went silent about the National Socialists in Ukraine. If Hate Not Hope had continued to point out the Nazi militias from Ukraine being openly trained by the governments of Canada, France, Germany, etc., or being honoured in the parliaments of the UK and Canada, Hate Not Hope would soon find their charitable status was gone. The lapdog, Hate Not Hope, is not going to bite the hand that feeds it. Stand back and look at the way the media and these government-approved organisations change their position over a period of years. Watch them switch from promoting one narrative, then when events change, they promote a different narrative. And just because they appear to style themselves as radical or anti-establishment, look at how their narratives move in sync with the establishment. Look at what they fail to say, as much as what they say. Look for their silences exposing that they are not committed to the principles they claim to uphold. It's important to understand the tricks and misdirection used by the powerful to turn the public away from supporting those who challenge the anti-democratic changes being brought by the elite. Leftism in general is sanitized by the elite and treated as a good thing, while the monstrous tyranny and genocides committed by communists and socialists are ignored by the political class, the media, and the educational system. Generations of students are now taking on debt to pay for degrees at universities where they are indoctrinated by leftists to the cult of leftism. As with the BBC, the elite get the public to fund their own indoctrination. It would be ironic if it wasn't tragic. The capitalist banking system profiting off people getting £50,000 into debt for which bankruptcy laws were changed so these young fools would never escape the debt. Since the 1st of July 2004, fixed-term student loans have not been approvable in bankruptcy. This means your student loan debt is not written off with your other debts at the end of bankruptcy. Bankruptcy laws were specifically changed to trap students. Teenagers were told, take on debt, get a degree, and you will earn more money than without a degree. It was obvious this was a scam. Or else why the need to change the bankruptcy laws? What high-earning professional would choose to be a bankrupt? Is it any wonder the elite extol leftism while banking the interest paid by the ignorant young adults who have already had more than a decade of compulsory leftist state education? The young cannot see they are being farmed like animals, paying for their own indoctrination. Because these young graduates are so brainwashed and incapable of doing any research of themselves, we've included as Appendix 12 Muhammad's Wars, listing the contents of the most authoritative Islamic biography of the man who founded Islam. These wars are proudly documented in this Islamic biography of Muhammad. Don't know where that came from, but hey, the biography of Ibn Ishaq. This 8th century text was translated into English in 1955 by a British professor at a prestigious university. After translating this book from Arabic, this professor subsequently received academic rewards from Islamic nations. So clearly they approved of his translation. The book is proudly published by the eminent Oxford University Press and printed in the Islamic State of Pakistan, where any denigration of Muhammad results in death. Thus, Muslims and the British elite demonstrably know the truth about Islam. It is a religion of war and subjugation. It's a conquering religion, basically. You can see from Appendix 12 that some 450 pages of this Islamic biography of the founder of Islam is about the robbery, murder, torture, and slavery conducted by Muhammad and his jihadi disciples. These are the facts which the fascist state seeks to conceal from the public, with teachers brainwashing children that Islam is a religion of peace. We all know it's not. With Christian clergy, politicians, and journalists brainwashing the adults with this lie. If you want a simple example of how corrupt the political system is, just consider the 50 years in which every state-controlled institution of Britain, police, schools, social workers, churches, charities for the protection of the quiet, whilst English schoolgirls were raped. Wait, where have I gone? Oh, protection of the children. No, I don't know where that other bit came from. Feminist groups, news media, academics, trade unions, etc., etc. Keep quiet while English schoolgirls were raped on an industrial scale by Muslim immigrants invited into Britain against the wishes of the electorate, us. All those institutions are funded by the state and controlled by the elite. The elite knew about Islam and the 1400-year history of Muslims taking slaves. And since slaves have no rights, the female slaves would be raped by Muslims throughout history. See, for example, the 1989 book Slavery in the Arab World, or the 2003 book Christian Slaves, Muslim Masters. This is all proven in Muhammad's Quran and in Easy Meat, both books with hundreds of pieces of evidence, but both books banned by Amazon at the request of the political class. Wouldn't you think the communists and feminists would have spoken out for the working class girls being raped on an industrial scale? Yes, but remember, the Trotskyists chose to ally with stroke number 8. Side with... chose to ally, and the communists are chose to ally with Islam. And the communists are the high priests of the cult of leftism. The rest and of the left are whipped into line by the fanatical high priests. Appendix 12 proves that throughout history, Muslims proudly recounted that Muhammad was an aggressive warlord attacking and robbing and killing those who did not submit to Islam, or would not submit to it. Those he did not kill, he took as slaves. And since Islam is based on copying the behavior of Muhammad throughout the past 1400 years, Muslims have continuously engaged in aggressive wars, slaughter, robbery, and slavery. Muhammad was nothing like Jesus or Buddha. What the West has experienced with jihad and sexual slavery is just authentic Islam. Muslims have seen these acts of Muhammad and his disciples not as evil, but as the moral behavior that will lead them to spend an eternity in paradise and the 72 virgins. That's not in here. Anyway, the elite knows that these facts about the doctrine of and history of Islam, yet they gaslight the public into believing a warlord and slaver was as peaceful as Jesus or Buddha. You have to be a special kind of stupid. That's my line, you asshole. No, you have to be a special kind of stupid to read that one page of Appendix 12 and then repeat the grand lie of President George Bush that Islam is a religion of peace. Those who say you must respect Islam are telling you that you must approve of those in state-funded mosques reading their handbook dedicated to your subjugation. The last 30 years of deception in the West around Islam where the public has been told lies by every institution in society shows how much the elite manipulate the public's understanding of what's going on in front of our eyes. How long before we're told that bearded jihadi who just massacred dozens of children identifies as a woman of peace? This is the nonsense the clergy, politicians, and journalists, academics, and anti-fascists want people to believe. If you don't actively oppose these lies, then you only have yourself to blame when your children are suffering tribal warfare in a decade or two. And we've got a whole bunch of notes by the looks of it. So pages 40 to and counting. Oh, fucking hell, there's a hell of a lot in here. Right, pages 40 to 50 is basically filled with notes on that introduction, the 40 pages that I've just read. There's quite a fair bit to this. So there's 5 chapters to this, by the looks of it. Next time, we'll be going through chapter 2, Farmed Like Animals. And this is something I will read, the quote, and I'll probably do it again in the next video. I'm just going to read this first quote in bold here and leave it at that. And I quote, "A really efficient totalitarian state would be one in which all the powerful executive political bosses and their army of managers control a population of slaves who do not have to be coerced because they love there's servitude. End quote. Aldous Huxley. Yes, I do use an envelope as a bookmark. Fucking sue me. Anyway, that is all for the manifesto book for now. But I may have to start doing a couple of sessions a day if I want to get through all of that. I mean, there's like, 350 pages of this? I think, 350 or so pages. So there is a lot to cover in that book. But I'm going to keep putting this out there because the truth needs to be told. People need to hear what's going on because, as that book clearly demonstrates with the 1%, 1% control the world. 4% are global sellout puppets. 90% of the world are still fast asleep. 5% know and are trying to wake up the 90%. And the 4% are trying to stop the 5% from waking up the 90%. Never forget that. We are engaged in a war with treacherous people whose only interest is to control us. They see us as resources. To some extreme extent, bags of meat walking around, and maybe bags of money along the side. We must do everything we can to oppose this, because if we do not oppose this, I can guarantee you that this country will end up becoming one of the same third world shitholes that a lot of these illegal immigrants and these Islamic scumbags are coming from. So remember, if any of you haven't bought the book, get Manifesto. Hey, free advertising for Tommy. Hey-ho. Anyway, point is, buy the book, educate yourself, as I'm doing, or sit here and watch this, and I'll read through the whole book. It may take a while, but you know what? I'm more than willing to spend the fucking time, because the bottom line is, the truth needs to be put out there. Because at the end of the day, there is a light at the end of that tunnel. For us, it's a light that will lead us to salvation. But for the treacherous two-tier media, judiciary, police, Keir the traitor Starmer, and all the political establishment's elites, the light at the end of the tunnel is merely the headlamp of an oncoming train.